Hello, I'm Karma Kitai, and I'm your host for Alivelihood, New Adventures as We Age. And I interview people over age 50 who have started anything new and fun and challenging in their middle to later years. Today I'm going to introduce you to Dennis Livingston, who has made several different career changes. So welcome, Dennis.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. So we're going to talk about your life story in bullet points, I think, today. And I know that, well, we certainly are going to talk a lot about your musical career, but that's your latest career.
That's right.
And you've started years ago at being a professor in political science, right?
That's right. I am a lapsed political scientist at this point. But I did, yes, that was my first profession. Got a degree in that field and became a teacher specializing in international relations and related subjects at various schools around the country. Never in Boston. I ended up here by other means. But that was the early career. And one thing about that, just the PowerPoint presentation quickly, is that has become relevant very recently. An interesting sort of closing of a circle is that I was one of the first people in the academic world to take an interest in teaching and talking about the future, or alternate futures, more properly, how the world might develop in the decades ahead, globally, using resources, population changes, these kinds of things. I was always very interested in science fiction. Grew up with that and still
Even
read a lot of
as
it.
a kid,
Oh,
you mean?
yes, sir, starting as a kid, that's right.
And you still
and
are.
still, very, that's what I read mostly, along with related fields of fantasy and speculative fiction. And that's been an influence in some ways, I think, through the varying careers we'll talk about. But so that fed into that.
So when you were in the political science department, you
Right.
taught a course on future studies.
Well, I developed this. Now we're talking about somewhere in the mid to late 60s and into the 70s. Yeah, when you might remember this author, Alvin Toffler, published a book called Future Shock, which is still a phrase well known. I mean, he really hit the mark and alerted a lot of people that we, well, there's culture shock, there's all sorts of shocks, but that the future, the rate of change has become accelerated in the 20th century to a degree that we now feel it. You probably have other people who perhaps have addressed that the life you led when you were growing up is not, in fact, likely to be the life you lead later, for all sorts of reasons, large and small. So, yeah. So when that book came out, it became respectable in a way to think about and talk about where are we going and how do we know any of that. There were tools for doing that. For me, it was like the golden rainbow opened and I could step over into Oz, because now talking about science fiction itself became also respectable. I was always telling
Even
people,
within an academic
within an
department.
academic, yeah, you might have to sell it. I had an elevator pitch ready for department heads who needed that.
You did sell it, huh?
Well, that's right, and it was it was very popular with students, so that was a big selling point. Of course, they go, oh my God, we get to talk about what I always am interested in, and so that was a concern, and I was able also to say, international relations, government agencies, big corporations, think tanks, they're all getting into this, and that's increased into the 21st century. It's amazing how the 21st century, right, was always this beacon far ahead, and lots of books would come out with titles like the year 2000 was the landmark. I couldn't believe it when it finally came. But that's been my adventure at the beginning.
Right, yeah. So what made you leave academia?
No, well, they left me. It was partly, you might say I talked myself into, or worked myself into not, I wasn't being a traditional kind of academic in my interests or my writing. And I tried to also be innovative in teaching. It wasn't all going to be lectures the way I was taught, and most of us were. I wanted to have students participating. I wanted to have guest speakers and take field trips, especially when I got into courses like Alternate World Futures was one of them, and Utopias, Dystopias was another. You could, in that period of time, and really still, start to visit places, communes, research centers, tech labs that were involved one way or another in, you might say, creating the possible futures that we would all experience later.
So that must have been a much more exciting
And
format.
that was fun, yeah. Well, they
to
again, the students like that, and I did too. I mean, in other words, I was trying to, the boundary, get away from the boundary between the classroom and the outside world. I think that's almost become the norm now in a lot of places, that you have to go back and forth to the extent that some grade schools, high schools are based almost entirely on visiting, where things are made, done, talked about, and then coming back to the class to talk about it.
Yeah. So you were a futurist in education.
I was trying to live right. I mean, not in any great. I had myself a traditional life. I did not live in any communes or even group houses. I tend to be a loner, ironically, that way. But I did get married, have a kid, went through that cycle. But yeah, my own life, you would not see anything particularly that you think this guy is not only teaching the future, he's from the future. But I would sometimes talk that way just for fun to get students involved. Let's pretend we're in 2000. Now it would be 2050. And what do you see? What do you hear? What are you reading? Are you still reading? How many genders are there? We might say now. We weren't thinking of that then. What new media is there around? All this stuff. It's fun to enter that mode.
So I think you said to me, though, that you and I guess in the field, they did not predict where we are now.
Oh, well, but
right?
Yes and no. I mean,
in terms of the computer.
Yeah, so especially what it would become. Of course, the computer was under development from the 40s on, and in some ways even before, theoretically.
Right. But nobody thought about it as being PC, right?
It's funny. That's right. Even, IBM, the large corporations, they didn't anticipate that the rate of change, even though they had something called Moore's Law eventually, was with this a computer scientist came up with the notion, and you could graph it, that the processors would get smaller, faster, the change would again accelerate in how these things developed. But somebody has to imagine, what does that mean for reality? And as we know now, and we've known for many decades, what it means is computers are going to get smaller, faster, more powerful.
And cheaper.
And oh yes, I left out cheaper. That's right. Is a consequence of all this. As people have made these analogies that you have probably in your smartphone or certainly in your home computer more power than the Apollo space rockets had, the ones who went to the moon, and you could make these comparisons. And more ability to do things is really the point. So, yeah, that sort of thing, you would have to turn to sci-fi for some of those visions. But even there, the notion of an internet, that a lot of people missed. Though some were talking about that early on, but not many. So it's fun to look at the predictions that didn't work out, right? Because you learn from that and see what happens.
Yeah. So we should go on to the next.
The next bullet point, right? So
bullet point.
So I was asked. It was obvious I wasn't going to get tenure and didn't, and so I decided time to get out. So make first life change. What do I do? Political science. I know something about policy. I could write, good English. So that's what took me to Boston. By then I was divorced, but our child was here with her mother. So I think, I want to be closer to that, have something of a family and easier to visit. So I looked around for a job. Amazingly, in those days, let's see, where are we into the early 80s? No, let me think a second. Was I skipping over? Let's see, 70s, 80s. Yes, I found an ad for a job with the state government here in Boston, being a policy analyst for the anti-poverty program we had. Then it had different names, but that's what it was about. And so I thought, oh, great. Well, I can write policy papers and
Sounds like you were somewhat of a risk taker.
Yeah, and I learned fast. Right. This is, I didn't realize it then, but I like to learn. When I go into a new field, I like the challenge. I absorb the material I need to know. This will become important a little later as we continue on, even more important. In that case, I was sort of taking a sidestep into a related field to what I had been teaching anyway in terms of political science. And so I got this job. I answered the ad. I got the job. The first thing in the interview they asked, of course, was, I see, well, you've been an academic for 10 or 12 years. You know, this is a 9-to-5 job. Can you come here every day at those hours and you're not going to get summer off? I said, oh, of course. And I said, I mean, what am I going to say? But of course I did that. I adapted quickly because I had to. And it was a different experience. And so I went through that for a few years. In that period, meeting my second and still wife, Karen Moss, who's an artist in Brookline. And she was always been, like a lot of wives, companions, very perceptive. She said, you know, this anti-poverty job, it's not going anywhere. I mean, I entered the field with such terrific timing. This was the period when Massachusetts had one of their periodic conservative governors, remember Ed King? And then a year or so after I took the job, Reagan got elected, and whoop, there goes the poverty budgets from federal and state. So it became a difficult time, certainly for the people experiencing it, but for our staff too, it was frustrating. So Karen said, look around again, and so I did that, got some job counseling, and eventually, now we have to, let's see, the next stage would be that I was always interested in technology from that sci-fi background. So here's the connections start to come. And computers are now in the, we're into the mid-'80s, were important to businesses and starting to come into the home. They had in this state, this region, the 128 belt they talk about, had a whole bunch
here
of...
in Massachusetts.
Yes, right here. Mid-range computer companies. Places like Wang and DEC and General Dynamics Digital, right. It's something. Late lamented companies now, looking back, because they too did not anticipate that computers where the field was going. But in any case, it was a powerful industry and important to our economy in that time. So I figured it's just some way I can attach myself. I didn't know a thing about computers, certainly technically, and I was just barely starting to get acquainted with using them myself. But what I learned in looking around is that Boston was also had a center of, they had a very large publishing company called Connors, you may remember. They were in Newton that brown building, in that area, just off the interstate. And so they too were advertising. I said, well, what is that world about? They were publishing trade magazines. As you may know, those are magazines that are sold to subscribers. They're free. Let me see. That was a contradiction, wasn't it? You don't have to subscribe that way. Yes, they go free to people, but what is meant is they depend entirely on ads that the companies take. So they had one called Systems Integration, and they said, sounds interesting.
What's
that mean? And but of course I did some research, looked up, and it was big, and still is an important field. I mean, if you're a company and you have computers from different other companies, computer companies, as many do, you have to find a way. They have to work together. They've got to be integrated. And so that's a big service field. IBM became important to that, and other companies also, and how to get them to work together to do whatever the goals are of the business.
Speak the same language.
That's right. I had to start to learn. There were protocols. Now they've vanished from memory, but of ways to so they would exactly speak the same language, know how to communicate, and things like that. So that was, I was really in some ways over my head, but what the company hired me because they knew they wanted somebody who could explain clearly how this kind of work was being done, who was doing
So
it.
were you writing for the lay person then, or more for
Well, it's the
technical?
business person, not necessarily the ones in the information departments, although they, I think, would read this too, but their bosses, people in other parts of the business who weren't technical,
Right.
but wanted to know this. And that was great because I got to, I mean, it's based on interviewing, so I got to talk to CEOs and tech people too and all that, so that was fun. And they would, they liked to visit trade magazines like this because they wanted to make sure you get stories in about their work.
And you could understand what they were talking about?
Well, if I didn't, you know, I would call and go over and over until that was my thing. I would go over and over, and that's kind of a learning thing. I mean, you know, the neurons must have been happy with all this going on. They tell us, you're right, you know, when
You're
it's like
going to
learning
live
Chinese
long
or something.
and
That's
not,
right.
not have any
You stimulate
dementia,
them.
right?
I want the systems integration, and so I would ask questions, right? And because often I would not understand. I had to, as I learn something at least to talk about how the integration process might work. But before long, what made me very happy is, and we'll end that phase with this, is that they decided I was really on a roll here. So why don't I just write case studies in a sense of businesses, and they would send me around the country, the magazine and the publishers, to visit what seemed to be impressive examples of these things. I'll just never forget going to Detroit when it was still Detroit. One of the seeing an assembly line, one of the car companies, how the robots and the computers and all that would go. And of course, for a sci-fi fan, I was in heaven when they sent me to Houston to go to the Space Center there. To talk about, you know, they were beginning to develop the hardware and the concepts of a space station. Imagine that. I think nobody realizes that there's something going around up there that still exists. But that was just beginning, and that was thrill for me to see the control. When they took me up to a room and pulled back the curtain, and I was looking, oh my God, it's Dr. Strangelove. This huge, you know, the things we see in movies all the time, guys at machines working out whatever their processes. So that was a good job. Lasted several years. And then in the way of these trade magazines, if the business you're rooted in starts to dry up, the ads go away, you're toast. And that was happening to a lot of the Connors magazines and trades for other publishers as well.
Right.
So the magazine folded, but now I had a resume as a writer in that world, and so I could do some freelance writing.
And you
and I did
were
for
able
another-
to maintain yourself
I
for a
just carried
while?
right on, because by that time, I had people knew my name. I had a byline, and so that I could just. But now I had to do the work, of course, as every freelancer knows who's watching this. You're the business, and so I would be in touch with the surviving trade magazines and computer publications, wherever they were, and there were a bunch, as there still are. Just to say, you know, I'm available if you have an assignment. So I go, and that would happen. You know, often
So
enough
you-
to be
you
make
no
a living
longer-
at it.
You no longer needed to have a 9-to-5 job, right? You could work on your
now-
your own schedule.
Yeah, more like 9 to 9 p.m. or something. I mean, it depends. You're always. What I learned quickly is, of course, the pressure is on. That while you've got one assignment, you better have 3 or 4 other feelers out
In
if
a
you want to keep
pipeline.
them rolling in a pipeline,
Right.
because you can't afford, most people in this, to let a lot of time pass without the payments.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm not somebody who likes pressure, but I'd already gotten used to that. Working for a magazine, of course, there were deadlines. And so, okay, that was fine.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while, and now we're ready for the next jump.
Yeah. So, are we on to the music
Yes, that gets us to the
topic?
music finally,
Okay.
right?
So I know that you come from an illustrious musical family.
Right, that was a help. So, right, we're into the 3rd or 4th career. There are others I haven't mentioned, but it was time. Well, what was happening in my life? Okay, so we'll rewind the tape back to, yes, to my parents. And in this case, my father, Jerry Livingston, was, and I'd like to think in some circles still is, a well-known songwriter from the
So you grew up with
pop
music
era.
from day one then, huh?
Yes, but we have to qualify this. I took for granted, like every kid does with a father. He's going, I don't know, he's off. So, as I learned later, he would be off. Well, we were in New York, of course, which was the center. Let's see, we're now talking 40s, 50s, as I was growing up. And in New York, the center of the music publishing industry was a place called the Brill Building. It's right off Times Square. It's still there because it housed all the major publishers in music. Now, of course, the industry has spread to other cities, Nashville and LA, but a lot is still in New York. But my dad actually was not from New York, as we think of, wasn't every songwriter, but from Denver, so of all things. But he had an ambition early in life to be a songwriter, and so he moved to New York, and amazingly, in the Depression days of the 30s, was able to make a good living as a songwriter. He was a composer, so he was always hooked up with lyric writer partners. So that's right. So he made his reputation there. So you want to know what songs might people know from the 30s and 40s that he was writing in. Well, the Talk of the Town was a beautiful ballad that you'll still hear. He's perhaps most famous for certain what they call novelty tunes, sort of silly tunes, of which the iconic example is Mersey Dotes. So it's a tune, you can't get out of your head. Right,
Yeah,
everybody
yeah.
grows up with that. I sometimes worry if the current generation, I say that, they say, what? But, and then I say, Mersey Dotes, Dozy Does, and Little Lambsy Ivy, oh, that one. Because it's been used through the decades in some ads and movies.
So I just want to make sure we get to your
Okay.
work.
Well, anyway, he did that.
And we might have a bit of time to go back to your family, which is really interesting. And your mother
I had
also.
that heritage. But what that meant, I do have to sneak in because it's also relevant that he moved us to LA in the early 50s because he was prescient about that the songwriting industry was moving, and he wanted to write for movies and TV, and ended up, in fact, writing a great score for the Disney film Cinderella.
Yeah.
So people still know that one, Bibbidi Bobbidi
Right.
Boo,
Yeah.
and The Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes. So all those
So
things.
to fast forward, though,
Okay.
you got into music
So when
yourself
now
after all
we're
these
in-
other careers.
We are now skipping, right, from the 50s to 60s, right. So I go in other directions because I was more of an intellectual, right, and the scholarly type. But I was always musical, yes, was always part of my life, but not his music. You kind of rebel against what your parents are doing when you think, so he's into pop music, and by the 50s, pop music was pretty dippy, if you remember, and not very interesting. So I was the classical music snob, and I love that stuff, and especially 20th century music. I was into that. So I had piano lessons, but my main instrument was flute. And so that followed me, and I still play it through all the years in high school and college bands and so on.
Yeah.
Now I like to improvise with jazz and sort of pick up music groups.
So at some point you started composing your own
what
music.
happens by into the early 90s, I inherit his copyrights to the songs he wrote. Like many songwriters, they often set up their own sort of family publishing companies. So that's what I got, and I decided to hold on to it. There are people who wanted to buy those songs, of course, and I said, so again, I went into my learning mode. I called friends of his who were still alive, of course, and entertainment lawyers who were very helpful. It's really something to say, no, keep this thing. It's like it'll be good for your family. I, the futurist, did not anticipate, like a lot of people, that that was a good choice economically because early 90s, by the middle to late 90s, we do have the internet and whole new sources of revenues for anybody, songwriters, publishers, begin to open up.
Right, so you learned how to
streaming, online, ringtones. Whoever heard of this? You have a phone that plays your song, let alone the traditional sources. So so I held on to that. And then so I decided, okay, I can run this company. I found there are ways you can be a one-person music company, and because there are organizations to help with that. Right. And then somewhere in there, Karen says, I was always noodling at the piano through my life, and especially then. She says, maybe you should try writing some songs. Well, I had done that actually as a teenager, but never picked it up. So the big transition came when a friend of ours who was a grade school teacher said, there's so few original good musicals for young kids in the lower grades to sing and perform. She said, I said, oh really? My antenna went up. Now I knew very little about musicals, let alone, and not really about songwriting either. I mean, I would hear my dad
like
at the piano.
everything else you've done in your life, you just
so I said,
learned it.
Musical for kids. Well, that's a good excuse. Here we go again. I'll do some research. I'll pick a science subject, like I did when I became a writer. I went into computer writing. And so I said, what would be fun? What do kids like? Dinosaurs. I said, oh, can't lose. Little did I know. Well, in any case, kids do love dinosaurs. And so I researched for a few months on that. That's what I love doing. And decided, okay, I'm going to write a 1-hour children's musical that focused on dinosaurs. I said, well, what? So I came up with a plot, doing the whole thing, book, music, lyrics, about how dinosaurs might have experienced their extinction 65 million years ago. I said, great, Hamlet for kids, everybody dies. But there's a way to do that. And so, to everybody's surprise, I don't know, 6 or 9 months later, I said, here's the musical. I've got, the book, the script, and the songs. Okay. And then I found a way to get help in developing it. So that was my first stab.
We're going to have to end the show with your song.
Oh, okay. So eventually I gave up on musicals and said, all right, I'm going to write songs. I'll write cabaret songs. That's,
and we have a wonderful song that's
so here's an example.
germane to Boston.
Yes.
So let's listen to that.
Good.
In Boston, winter has many attractions, skiing, ice skating, and such.
Yeah. Then there's shoveling driveways and skidding on highways. It all gets to be a bit much.
Frankly, as the cold unfolds, here's what I'd say. Nothing becomes winter more than when you see it melt away. Springtime in Boston, people are lost in thoughts of a summer fling.
Back Bay is blooming,
Baseball is booming,
Every bird wants to sing.
temperatures rising. Is it surprising if there's romance in the air?
A scholar's oars dip up and down.
Persephone is back in town.
Winter's past.